study the discipleship manual. That is the manual for the followers of Jesus Christ, for those of us who follow Jesus. And that's reading from the Beatitudes. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak, and he taught them, saying, "Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy." Thus ends the reading of the word. Atop the mountain, Jesus speaks to his followers, his disciples, about being merciful in a time of oppression. The meaning of the Beatitude is simply that if humans show mercy to one another, then God will be merciful to them. There is no expectation of some human tit for tat here or some equity of treatment. There is to be no expectation that if I show mercy to you, I ought to expect you to show mercy to me in return. The mercy I will receive for my acts of mercy will be from God. This fifth step in discipleship ramps up the difficulty in the steps we take toward holiness. If we seek to take on this mark of discipleship, if we seek to bear this mark of Jesus Christ, we must be prepared not to see the results immediately. We must be prepared not to see the results soon. We must be prepared to maybe not even see the results in our lifetime. Let us face it. We are awed when some human being behaves in a godlike fashion and shows us mercy, helps us out in a time of trouble. We talked about this the other day in our Bible study, about people helping us out, doing us a favor in a time when we were vulnerable, when we were helpless to help ourselves. This is the message of Luke's story of the Good Samaritan. And if you remember, the Pharisee approaches Jesus in Luke's story and says to Jesus, "Now how is it I can gain eternal life?" And Jesus says, "Well, what's the commandment?" And the Pharisee says, "Well, you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind, and all of your strength, and your neighbor as yourself." And the Pharisee says, and Jesus says, "You're right. You're absolutely right. Now, do that." And the Pharisee says, "Yeah, but who's my neighbor?" And Jesus proceeds to tell him a story about a man who was beaten up and stripped of all of his clothing and stripped of all of his possessions and left to bleed to death or die on the road. And this body, which was on the road, happened to be passed by a priest, and who crossed over to the other side of the road and went on his way. And it perchance it happened that a Levite also walked up to the body and saw it and crossed over to the other side of the road, passed by on the other side of the road and went on. And the expectation of the Pharisee in Jesus' story would be that Jesus would say the next person coming along was a Judean. And the Judean helped the man who had been beaten and left for dead. But that's not what Jesus said. What Jesus said was a Samaritan came along, and a Samaritan helped the man. The Samaritan was the one in the story who showed mercy. The one who shows mercy, says Jesus, is the one who is truly living out the commandment to love God and neighbor. However, it is not right for us either to pass judgment on the priest. It is not right for us either to be comfortable in passing judgment on the Levite, both who crossed the road to the other side when they saw the man left for dead at the side of the road. It's our tendency, however, to find the hero in the story and embrace him or her. It is our want and perhaps our nature to see those who failed as those worthy of our scorn and our judgment. But you see, Matthew's Jesus is challenging us to be merciful to the Levite and the priest, as well as the man left on the side of the road. To be truly merciful is to give thought to what the busy priest had been doing just before he came upon the man left for dead on the side of the road. We have a tendency to think about the fact that, well, he was in a hurry to get somewhere, and maybe he was torn, but simply couldn't stop. But think about this. What if the priest had just spent the last 36 hours sitting at the bedside of a loved one or a sick friend? If we assume that the priest, by his failure to act, was indifferent or callous to a fault, then we have unmercifully passed judgment upon him. The same for the Levite, who was perhaps working his fingers to the bone, helping to build or restore a synagogue that was destroyed in an act of retaliation by the Roman troops. We don't know. What if he was so exhausted, so downcast and despairing, that he does not have one more ounce of energy to muster the compassion it will take to take care of the probably dead man? It may be that the Pharisee who asked the question of Jesus in the first place would consider these things. But what about us who are overhearing the story? We have tended to look upon the priest and the Levite with disdain, and even the Pharisee who asked the question. We tend not to give even a single thought to the robbers who stripped and beat the man and left him for dead in the first place. Jesus and the Samaritan are for us the heroes of the story, and we want to be on the side of the good guys. Perhaps the parable in this story for us is that we are to work to fully understand the staggering nature and expectations of being merciful. In any moment that we decide to pass judgment upon those who did not do what we thought they ought to do, Jesus tells us to stand outside those emotions, to step beyond our injury or sense of indignation and be merciful. Jesus instructs us as disciples, certainly, to look at the wider picture if we are able, and if not, be merciful first, always, and anyway. What one person is able to do for another is not the barometer by which we are to measure all others. In Jesus' parable, the Samaritan had the necessary supplies to care for the victim of the crime. The Samaritan had at his disposal bandages, oil, and wine to bind up the injured man's wounds. The Samaritan had an animal and the ability to transport the man to an inn. The Samaritan had money to care for the injured man. He had the energy and the will to take care of the injured man. He judged himself able and willing to help, and we are grateful for his example. There is another story in Scripture which talks about what it means to be merciful. It is one which Matthew tells in chapter 18, verses 23 through 35. It follows immediately Peter's question to Jesus, where Peter says, "Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times?" Jesus said to him, "Not 7 times, but I tell you, 77 times." And others have translated that not 77 times, but 70 times 7 times, which is 490 times. Then Matthew's Jesus tells the story immediately after that question of the slave who owed his master 10,000 talents. When he came came before his master and could not pay the debt, his Lord ordered him to be sold, along with his wife and his children and all of their possessions, and from this, payment of his very large debt would be made. But the slave fell to his knees before his Lord, saying, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything." Out of pity, the Lord of that slave released him and forgave him the debt. Now, I hope you understand what that means. The Lord of the slave wiped the slate clean of the man's debt. The Lord forgave the debt completely. In a moment of compassion and pity, the Lord gave him a pass. He no longer owed the debt at all. It was canceled, all 10,000 talents of it. Incredible. Now, that slave left, having been released of his debt, and he bumped into one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii. In a flash, he seized the man by the throat and said, "Pay me what you owe me." And then his fellow slave fell to his knees and pleaded with him, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything." But the first slave refused, and threw his fellow slave into prison until he would pay the debt. When the Lord, the master, found out what the forgiven slave had done, he summoned him and said, "I forgave you because you pleaded with me. Should you not have had mercy on your fellow slave as I had mercy on you?" And Jesus says, "Therefore, forgive your brother and your sister from your heart." The mark of the disciple is not to seek revenge or retribution for injustice. The mark of the disciple is to be merciful in unmerciful circumstances. The mark of a disciple is to show the same mercy to others that God has shown to us. The mark of the disciple of Jesus is not to search out who to blame for what we consider injustice, or because in doing so, we then perpetuate injustice. The mark of the disciple of Jesus is to be merciful to those who have suffered injustice and merciful to those who have perpetrated it. Blame perpetuates evil. We are all guilty of it. We have all sinned against God in this way. But the nature of God is to keep on forgiving us if we but ask. I want to share a poem with you. It was written, it's important for you to know when it was written. It was written in the 1960s. Many of you remember what a time of turmoil that was in the history of this country. It's called "The Cold Within." 6 humans trapped by happenstance in dark and bitter cold. Each one possessed a stick of wood, for so the stories told. Their dying fire in need of logs, the first woman held hers back. For on the faces around the fire she noticed one was black. The next man looking across the way saw one not of his church and couldn't bring himself to give the fire his stick of birch. The third one sat in tattered clothes. He gave his coat a hitch. Why should his log be put to use to warm the idle rich? The rich man just sat back and thought of the wealth he had in store and how to keep what he had earned from the lazy, shiftless poor. The black man's face bespoke revenge as the fire passed from sight, for all he saw in his stick of wood was a chance to spite the white. The last man of this forlorn group did not, except for gain. Giving only to those who gave was how he played the game. The logs held tight in death's still hands was proof of human sin. They didn't die from the cold without. They died from the cold